just to echo what Father Keith said at the beginning of the Mass, if your baby is unhappy, there is a beautiful hall where you can take them and where you can still follow the Mass. Well, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was in the United States, in Washington, and one afternoon with a group of colleagues went to a recently opened Museum of the Bible in the center of the city. Well, we might say it's all very American, very large. It's a museum that is telling the whole story of the formation of the Bible, how it was written, the world to which it belongs, all the different versions and translations and the printing and the publishing and the impact and influence of it. It's, as I say, it was a huge affair, and it cost unbelievably about $400 million to set this up. Well, one of the features in it is that you can walk through the history of the Old Testament. You put on 3D glasses and you move from room to room, and there are all kinds of sound effects and visual effects and a commentary, and you even walk through the Red Sea without getting wet, of course. And the commentary is given by someone with a rich Jewish New York accent, who turns out at the end to be Ezra the scribe from the 5th century BC, recounting the history of his people. Well, Lent is many things, isn't it? I mean, Lent is prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. We say that. Lent is the sacraments, preparation for the sacraments. It's following Christ, reflecting on his passion, its conversion of heart. But it too, Lent also, is a walk through the Old Testament. That's not something we might think of, but that's very much what we do at the Easter Vigil, to which I encourage all of you to come. You know, your year is not worth living if you do not come to the Easter Vigil. And there we have 7 readings, if you do the whole shoot, 7 readings from the Old Testament leading to the New. And again, every Sunday of Lent, in the first readings, we go through step by step the Old Testament. So last Sunday, we heard of Noah and the flood and the new covenant, the new beginning that follows from that. Today, we have this terrible and magnificent story of Abraham and his son and the blessing that follows on Abraham's obedience. Next Sunday, the first reading is the giving of the law through Moses on Mount Sinai. Then we have the 4th Sunday. It's a little summary of how the Jews later on were exiled from Jerusalem, the city destroyed, went to Babylon, and then, by the mercy of God, were able to come back some 70 years later and rebuild. And lastly, there is a reading from the prophet Jeremiah on the new covenant. So we go step by step. These are just selected highlights. But there's something to think about here. Why should we do this? Why should we bother with this? There are many reasons. We might ask ourselves, how well do I know the story of the Old Testament, the story of the people of Israel? The only way you can tell if you know a story is if you can tell it to somebody else. Could I tell this story, creation and fall, flood and covenant, Abraham and the promise, Moses and the Exodus, David and the kingdom, the exile and the return, prophets and hope? Do I know that story? If I'm from another country and I want to take out citizenship, say here, well, you're given a book, you have to read, you have to go through an exam. And that exam includes, you have to learn about the history of the UK. You have to learn about the Celts and the Picts and the Scots and the Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans and the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution and the Empire and Parliament and all of this. We have to know that. And so I think we too should know this history. Now, but again, we might say, why? Why? Well, you could go on and on and on as to why, but obviously this time of year we are moving towards Easter, towards the commemoration and celebration of Jesus' death and resurrection. This happened at the time of the Jewish feast of Passover. It happened in the city of Jerusalem. Jesus passed, says St. John, from this world to the Father. It was the new Exodus. It was the new Exodus. The central event of the Old Testament was the exodus of the people of Israel from Egypt and their journey to the promised land. And that is what we have in a new form, thanks to Christ, our journey through the Red Sea of baptism, through the desert of this life, if you like, trying to follow Christ to the promised land of heaven. We cannot understand, possibly, who Christ is without recalling all this background. Well, if you marry, it would be lovely in a way just to marry your spouse, but in fact you get a whole family, as we know, along with your partner. Like it or lump it, as it were, and there they are. Well, the church is married to Jesus. We are married to Jesus, and we have to take on his family, his background, his history. This was his history. He was a Jew. He is a Jew. This is in his blood. All these stories, this is what he learned as a child, what he lived through, what he remembered, how he prayed. We need to connect, so we have to take all this on if we want to know Jesus. Now, going back to those 3D glasses, in a way, it is a question of seeing Jesus in 3D, really. And if you think of today's gospel is of the transfiguration. It is very much, it's in words, but it is very much a picture. It has been painted again and again very beautifully, Fra Angelico and Raphael and many others. It lends itself to art, this story of the transfiguration. And there Jesus is transfigured before the disciples, and there appear to him, it says today, Elijah and Moses talking with him. Why should Elijah and Moses be there? Because Elijah is a symbol of prophecy, Moses is a symbol of the law, and the law and the prophets is one way of summing up the Old Testament. And Jesus, therefore, because these two appear on either side of him, speaking with him, says the Gospel of Luke, about the exodus that he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem, this shows who Jesus is. If we didn't, so Jesus ceases to be, if you like, two-dimensional. He becomes three-dimensional. And just we could press this a little further. You know, in painting, there is this thing called perspective, and it was a great discovery when artists discovered how to do that. And so perspective, you've got a two-dimensional surface, but perspective enables us to make this picture three-dimensional, at least to our eyes, to make it so that we see a painting as we see reality. And so there is, as it were, the central object, there is the central subject of the painting there on the mountain of transfiguration. There is Jesus, but then there is this depth, there is this background. And therefore, Jesus appears, as it were, in context. Now you can then take a subtle step on, because in painting, there is also something called reverse perspective. And this comes into play with icons, when, if you like, it's not so much that the third dimension is in the painting, it is rather in the person looking at the painting. So the lines, as it were, come out from the painting to the onlooker, and the onlooker is drawn into the painting. Now, on the mountain of the Transfiguration, you have both of those. You have a background in Moses and Elijah, and then you have the disciples, Peter, James, and John. Then you have us. And so we have, if you like, an IMAX Jesus. You have a three-dimensional Jesus. You have the people of the Old Covenant behind him, as it were, and you have us, the people of the New Covenant, the disciples, and Christ the center. And so suddenly the whole thing becomes alive, and we become part of the painting. We walk through the door, and there we are in this world. Well, that's just a thought, but just to end with something that kind of flows from this, the old catechisms always said the Christian has three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. Okay, as we make our exodus towards the promised land. Now, last Sunday, the Sunday of the temptation, we heard of the devil. But let's just think about the world. How is the world an enemy to us? How does the world get a hold on us? Well, today especially, I think, by images. Images. We are assaulted day in and day out by images. We are surrounded by them. We are invaded by them. We are enthralled by them. If you go to a dentist's waiting room and there's a screen, it's very hard not to look at that screen. Moving image, very hard not to look at it. We get drawn into it. It's probably complete rubbish, but we get drawn into it. Images can contaminate us. Pornography, there it is. They're all there so easily. Now, we might consider as a Lenten exercise fasting from images, fasting from them, or at least trying to replace them with good ones. Because images, a constant barrage of images, make us very superficial. We flick from one to one. We pass. We're constantly changing. And so we never reflect. We never pause. Somebody said the other day, we've lost the art of thinking because we're just going from picture to picture. We're sort of in a daze, really, in unreality. And I know somebody who, for his Lenten exercise, drew the gospel of each Sunday. That's a very good idea, because he's then creating an image of Christ to look at. The Bible is a forest of images. This is one very good reason for reading the Bible. Well, when I was young, we had these ladybird books and so on, and biblical stories. And I can still remember, to this day, picture of Jesus, the boy, sitting on a rock outside Nazareth, thinking. And I thought, oh yes, I'm a boy too. Jesus was a boy. And I rather like the idea of sitting and thinking, rather than doing anything. And that image remained with me. But I would say to parents, and really mean this, be very thoughtful, be very attentive to the images that your children are imbibing. Think how much care we take about diet, about what we eat. Not too many sweets, not too much fast food, and so on. But we should be more careful about the images that we take on, because these form us, these manipulate the brain in a big way, and put in good images, diminish the number, but guide your children to good images. And make sure that they linger with those. They don't just flick, 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 but that they take them on. Don't let them surf it on them. Don't use images to sedate them and keep them quiet. Even the harmless ones. Teach them how to use images. Guide them to the good ones and encourage them to create their own. Because this is our wonderful ability. Create your own. Don't just download them all the time. Make your own images, far better. So, that's just a word of encouragement. There, in their presence, he was transfigured. And we prayed today in the collect that our spiritual sight might be purified, that our insight might be purified. If it's cluttered with images, it will not be purified. But if we turn it in prayer, in perhaps our own little attempts at drawing and painting, then our insight will be purified and will be taken out of a fantasy world into the reality. We will see Jesus in 3D. We will see Jesus in IMAX. We will see reality. That's Lent, and that is Easter. Thank you.